There we go. All right, folks. Hello. My name is Grant Gainey. I am a principal engineer at Red Hat. I have been on the Pulp team for 6 years now and at Red Hat forever. And I'm going to give what will be a short talk on a small feature that we added um, recently to Pulp in response to the needs of the Copper team, actually, are the ones who initially had the RFE for this. And I'm not sure people have heard about it. So hopefully you'll find this useful in your own workflows. So we're going to be talking about adding content labels in Pulp, which just went in this year. So what we're going to go over here is some of the history of labels in Pulp because they've existed for a while in other contexts, what a label looks like, some caveats of adding them to content as opposed to the current or previous places where labels had been added. And then I'm going to give a little demo of how you can access them and use them in your Pulp instance, do a little review, and then take any questions that you all have. This should be a fairly short presentation. All right, let's talk a little bit about the history of labels. The initial request for Pulp was the ability to categorize the large-scale entities, repositories, remotes, and distributions for being able to do things like I want to categorize all of my repositories that have rel 8 content, even though I've got 27 of them, with some label. Doesn't change the repository, but just lets me find all of the related repositories, let's say. And this was introduced quite a while ago. In 2021, Core 310 introduced the ability to label each of these entities. You can see the documentation here for how all that works. It's been in there for quite a long time. However, recently, Copper, and as we had our initial contact with Copper and maybe replacing their backend with Pulp, said they need to label individual pieces of content, as you have heard in previous talks earlier in the week. Copper wanted to be able to label content with things like the build ID that this particular, say, RPM package had come from. They wanted it to be able to have metadata that could change, but content is immutable. So there are a number of things that they wanted to do that we just couldn't handle at the time. Content is shared, which makes this problem a lot harder to solve. If you have a repository that you label, there's only one in Pulp. But if you have a given SHA-256 piece of content, it might be in 27 different repositories. So it's a more difficult problem to solve. With Core 373, we extended the existing concept of Pulp labels, tried to reuse the same code to content. And there's documentation for that, for some of the changes. And as you can see, it's on the same page as the labeling everything else documentation. And it also lists a few extra caveats to that process. So what does a label look like? What's our goal? The idea was to associate arbitrary metadata to entities to make it easy to filter and search based on this metadata. The implementation is labels. Pulp labels are a JSON dictionary of key value pairs. And you can see an example here. I've got a key called environment, and it might be dev or prod or stage. I've got a key called build ID. Maybe it's a date or a timestamp. Have I reviewed this content? Is a use case that we have seen users have. True or false? Nobody's actually looked at this thing yet, whatever the thing is, whatever the entity is. There's some caveats with content. Because content is shared across repositories, it's deduplicated. Because our role-based access control is controlled at the repository level, not at the content level, there can be a conflict. And here's the example. User 1, I'm going to sync my content, I don't know, Fedora, into my repository 1, and I'm going to label it as a piece of content, a given RPM I'm going to label. User 2, in the same Pulp instance, in the same domain, syncs the same content into their repository. And the sync says, I already have that content. I can just say it exists in this repository version. I don't have to get new. See if I can get that person in. Oh, somebody already did. Thank you very much. And they label it with their label. Now, if you look at that piece of content, it has two labels, both user one and user two, or maybe user two unlabeled, unset a label and then reset it. So in a multi-user environment, this is not a great thing. And we had to figure out how to deal with this possibility because of the shared nature of content. So possibilities we considered when we were going through the responding to that RFE from Copper was to make content labels be separate from the content. That there would be for a given repository version, there would be a list of label to content mappings, new mapping table. It's definitely not the current pattern. It makes things a little slower. Um, there are a whole bunch of downsides to taking that path. A second thought was, you know, maybe content doesn't need to be deduplicated. Maybe a separate content unit is not just the SHA-256 of the content, but the SHA-256 in a repo would be the unique identifier for content. The problem with that is it's a very invasive change. It's not the base architecture of Pulp. It also breaks contracts that Pulp gives to both plugins and to users. If a given SHA-256 exists in Pulp, it exists once. Just the impact there would have been quite large. And then the third possibility was, okay, what if setting labels was restricted so that the admin of the Pulp instance could say, user one, in the example I gave before, they're allowed to set labels, but user two is not. Uh, what we went with was restricting the labeling permission. This enabled the feature for the Copper use case. It made it usable for a variety of user workflows. Some Pulp instances are going to say that doesn't work for me for whatever reason. Then you're probably not going to be able to take advantage of this feature until in a future perhaps X version of Pulp, we go back and figure out perhaps we don't we don't deduplicate content, and that will make things a lot easier. So there is a new role in Pulp called content labeler, which has to be given explicitly to the user. If we look at the documentation for labeling, this is how you assign that role to a given user in your Pulp instance. Obviously, if you don't have domains enabled, you won't need this. And then only users with that ability can uh, add labels to content. It's a compromise. I don't know that any of us were 100% happy with it. Copper was, because in their instance, it's fine. We have, like, as I said, there are Pulp instances where there is just the admin user and all this just works. But it's not exactly the perfect answer. But that's where we are. That's where we are today to answer the RFE. All right, I'm going to give a demo of how this looks in practice. And what I'm going to show is labeling some existing entities, labeling as you upload entities, searching on labels, updating labels, and removing labels. And the script that you'll see me copying and pasting out of is available up on GitHub. That link is there. When you look at my slides, you'll be able to get it. So give me a moment to switch to my bash script and make sure everybody can see this. All right, that should be readable to everyone. Okay, over on the right-hand side here, this is just my Pulp instance logging running over here. It's teeny tiny, and I've had somebody ask me this earlier this morning. This runs in a way that I can't read it because when tracebacks happen, the pattern is changed enough that I can go up, something happened, and look over there. So up here in the top, we have the script, my test script, and then this is where I'm going to be, down here is where I'm going to be running the commands. The first thing in the script is to actually create and sync. This is me creating a Pulp file remote, creating a repository, and then syncing it. I already did that just to save some time. So we have a repository called PulpCon'25 demo. Now, what I'm going to show you here is this is the things that have existed since 3.10 are, for example, labeling a repository. And the CLI supports that. You say, I have a repository, I want to label it, I want to set the label, here's the repository. Here's the key I want to set and the value I want to set. I'm going to hit enter. Okay. And now let's see if we can list a repository that has a label of foo. And all I want to show is the PRN of the repository, the name of the repository, and the labels field just to show you what you're going to get back. We don't need to see the whole repository JSON. All right, so we found a repository which has the label that we just set, which is key foo value bar, and that's the name of the repo. So you can see that that happened. What happens if you ask for something ridiculous, like I want to select baz equals bar, which doesn't exist anywhere in my pulp instance? We find nothing. So that just shows how labels work today. All right, now the primary use case for the copper feature is when I upload, I want to be able to assign labels at the time that happens. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab the PRN of that file repository so I have it available for me. Now, right now, and this is a discovery I made as I was preparing this script earlier this week, we need to add some CLI support for this. But right now, you have to talk directly to the REST API. And what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be uploading a file content. Here's the name of the file. Up. And Grant skipped a groove here. Let's make some content for us to actually upload first. All right, so I've created some content, which is a good thing. Okay, now I'm going to upload that content with that file that we just created. I'm going to give it a relative path. I'm going to assign labels on upload, which is the thing that's missing from the CLI, and I want to put it directly into that repository. And we can look at this task. Right here. And you can see that the upload completed successfully. State completed. All right. So we uploaded it. Now let's see if we can find it. This time we're not doing file repository, we're saying file content. I want you to show me all the file content, and I want you to select by label, where the label is the build ID, the build ID equals that we just uploaded. And again, I'm just going to show a little bit of the content. It's PRN, it's name, labels, and relative path. And content doesn't have a name, so that's me. My script needs to be fixed. You can see the label that we put in at the upload, and you can see that it is in fact the file that we just uploaded. Okay. Now, I just want to show all the content that has a build ID. Anybody that has a build ID. Let's show that. Same thing. We're going to find the same content. I want to show all the content that doesn't have a label build ID. And you can, the key here is, come here. There we go. There's a not here. And now I can see I have 3 content that I got when I synced that have no labels. So they clearly don't find one labeled build ID. All right. Next thing we're going to do here is we're just going to grab the PRN of anything that has the one thing that has a label of build ID 1234, so we can use that. Okay. Now I want to add a new label to that content. So the first thing I'm going to do is say I'm going to set a label on the content with this PRN with a key of Frodo and a value of lives, because he does at the end of the story. Just a note about Pulp CLI, that I'm saying --href, but I'm giving it a PRN because you can use PRNs anywhere that you can use hrefs in CLI. Okay, so that you're like, okay, you didn't do anything, Grant. Let's take a look at that piece of content now. And now, if we look at the labels of that content, here's the Pulp labels of the same content. And here's the build ID label that was there. And here's the new label, Frodo Lives. So you can see us adding a new label to the content. And now I'm going to change some content similarly from lives to leaves, because Frodo did leave at the end of the story. We'll take a look at that content again. And we can see that now Frodo leaves. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to unset a label. I don't want that label anymore. And we're going to take a look at the content. And now you can see we're back to just build ID 1234 for that content. So that's the demo that shows us using content labeling in action. Let me switch back to my other presentation. Here, there we go. So that was our demo. Let me get back to my presentation. So just to review, labels are just a JSON dictionary, key value pairs. Because content is deduplicated, labels are shared, which is suboptimal. And the way that one controls that in a Pulp instance is by being selective about who is allowed to set and unset labels. And you have to explicitly assign that. And the documentation gives you some help on how to do that. All right, that's my presentation. Any questions from folk that I can answer? Jared.
Not really a question, but just a little heads up that when using domains, content between domains is not deduplicated. And so your labels will be unique per domain.
Correct. That is the deduplication process. And one of the things that we had thought about, and in several contexts, was, hey, don't most Pulp instances only really have one user? And if you want to have, a second user, you're going to give them a second domain. In some workflows, the answer is absolutely yes. One user, one domain, and then this problem goes away. However, there are absolutely existing Pulp instances, large ones out there where there's a lot of users in a single domain where that's just not an option. Let's see, Mache has a question in chat here. So if user 2 can see the content, the way that the content is, it's not so much that the user can see a specific piece of content, it's that the user has access to view the repository the content is in. So if I create repository 1, so I'm the owner of it, and I sync it or upload content into it, I'm the only one that can see that repository. I may grant, or my admin may grant user 2 the ability to view that repo or all repositories. Then user 2 can see the repository and can see the content in it, and therefore can see the labels associated with that content. Does that answer your question, Mache? I'm going to assume it does. Other questions? So what happens when you upload content, if an existing piece of content with a given SHA-256 exists in Pulp for whatever reason, synced, uploaded, whatever, and you're another user and you upload that content, Pulp is going to find the existing content because it's the same SHA-256. So, and it is attached to the same artifact. To Jared's point, if you want content separation, like what you're aiming at here, between users, where user 1 has a piece of content that they uploaded and maybe they're going to do something to it, and you want user 2 to upload the same content and not have any contact with user 1's content, that's where domains come in. Because if user 1 is in domain 1 and user 2 is in domain 2, that the content and artifacts are not shared between domains, and the individual users have complete control over it. And that's just a basic architectural fact of the way that Pulp works today. Does that help?
I think the main point is that, if the content is inside the same domain, even if it's across two different repositories and those users of those two repositories don't have permission on the other one, the shared content will share the labels. And so user 1 can see user 2's label, user 2 can see user 1's label.
Correct. And if that's an issue, and it is for some Pulp instances, it's absolutely an issue, then this is not a useful feature, unfortunately. Just because we would have to have made some pretty invasive changes to make it possible.
Um, I don't know if
David,
I missed it in the demo, but when you upload piece of content and it's already existing in the database and you supply labels, does it just
mhm.
overwrite the existing labels or does it update the labels?
That is an outstandingly good question. It's too bad we don't have the person that implemented this here to answer it. No, that would be me. Um, Off the top of my head, Jared, I do not know the answer to that. Um, so if you would do me a favor, ping me in either Slack or Matrix and say, hey, Grant, answer this question. I will do that experiment today and I will add it to the slides once I find out the answer. How's that? Very good. David has a question. Can labels be used to store metadata or info about the content? The value can be whatever you want. So, uh, you could have for a given piece of content, you could have security scan result, and then you could put the results in while you're waiting for the various plugins to implement the vulnerability reporting. That uh, maybe that answers your need as well. That you kind of
Mhm.
measure we're talking about.
Yeah. Copper uses it to store build IDs,
Mm-hmm.
so they can query using that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I can imagine putting any kind of metadata that's relevant for your organization.
Exactly right.
Um, it can be, you know, information about architecture or information about dependencies that were used to build the package.
Yep.
There's just a lot of things that may be important to you, and
Yep.
you want to be able to search. The main thing is that this allows you to search for that content.
Yeah. Yeah, see, it's an HStore field. The other thing, and this is kind of a subtle point, what because content and artifacts in Pulp are immutable. We identify them by SHA-256. Pulp label isn't included in that, so you can change your labels without changing the content itself, um, which is important. You don't want a new piece of content, for example, if a given RPM goes from has anybody reviewed this RPM, for example, where the reviewed label is false to reviewed to true. That doesn't change the content. That's really just information about your workflow. So that's another subtle piece of why this is a useful function. Other questions? We have time for one or two more. Okay. Outstanding. Great questions, folks. Thank you very much. I hope you find this useful. Let me stop the recording.